His eyes, bloodshot and narrow, swept the cabin with the proprietary gaze of a man who considered everything within these walls to be his absolute domain. The children's bed, the rough-hewn table, the iron-cook stove that barely held enough heat to warm a pot of coffee, and most especially the woman who stood before him with downcast eyes and hands folded in perfect submission. "Supper ready?" Roy's voice slurred slightly, but Caroline had learned to detect the razor's edge beneath even his most casual questions. Everything was a test with Roy, every word a potential trap that could spring shut without warning. "Yes," she replied softly, moving toward the stove with practiced efficiency. "Salt pork and cornbread, just as you like it." She served him at the table, setting the plate down with careful precision, making sure the fork was positioned exactly as he preferred it. Roy ate in silence for several minutes. The only sounds in the cabin, the scrape of metal against tin, and the whispered breathing of two children trying to become invisible, but Caroline knew. This quiet was deceptive. Like the stillness before a tornado, Roy's silences were often more dangerous than his rages, pregnant with an energy that built pressure until it had to find release somehow. She busied herself cleaning the few dishes they owned, her movements economical and soundless. "Ran into Jeremiah Walsh in town today," Roy said suddenly, his voice carrying a conversational tone that immediately put Caroline on high alert. When Roy spoke in that particular way, friendly and almost pleasant, it meant he was setting a trap. "He mentioned seeing you at Henderson's store yesterday." Caroline's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. She had indeed gone to Henderson's, trading eggs from their 3 hens for a small bag of flour. It had been a perfectly ordinary transaction, conducted in full view of half the town. But she already sensed that Roy had twisted it into something else entirely. "I needed flour," she said simply, not turning around. The children were asking for biscuits. Funny thing, though. Roy's chair creaked as he leaned back, and Caroline could feel his gaze boring into her back like a physical weight. "Jeremiah said you were talking to that Henderson boy. Laughing even. Said you looked mighty pleased with yourself." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and inescapable. Caroline knew that any response would be wrong, but silence would be worse. She had learned that Roy's jealousy was a living thing, fed by his own insecurities and the whiskey that amplified every slight, real or imagined, into proof of her betrayal. "Timothy Henderson helped me load the flour into the wagon," she said carefully, measuring each word. "I thanked him, as is proper. Nothing more." Roy's laugh was harsh and bitter, a sound that made both children flinch beneath their covers. "Nothing more," she says. As if I'm fool enough to believe that. As if the whole town ain't talking about Roy Cutter's wife making eyes at boys young enough to be her son. Caroline turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "There was no impropriety, Roy. I swear it on my mother's grave. Timothy is barely 16, and he was only being helpful." "Helpful?" Roy stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound like fingernails on bark. "That what you call it?" "When my wife parades around town, grinning like a schoolgirl at any man who shows her attention." The familiar pattern was unfolding, as predictable as sunrise, but no less terrifying for its repetition. Caroline had learned that Roy's accusations always grew more elaborate with each telling, gathering details like a snowball rolling downhill until a simple act of courtesy became an elaborate betrayal in his whiskey-soaked imagination. "I wasn't parading," she said quietly, but the words seemed to inflame him further. "Don't you dare lie to me." Roy's voice cracked like a whip, and from the bed came a small whimper that might have been Luke. "I know what I know, Caroline. I got eyes and ears all over this town, and they all tell me the same thing. My wife's been making a fool of me, and by extension, making a fool of them." Caroline wanted to point out the cruel irony of his words, that the same townsfolk who whispered about her bruises and judged her for staying were apparently eager to carry tales that would earn him more. But she had learned long ago that logic held no power against Roy's rage, that any attempt to defend herself would only provide more fuel for the fire consuming their home. "The children are listening," she said instead. Hoping to appeal to whatever remained of his paternal instincts, Roy glanced toward the bed where Emma and Luke huddled together. Then back at Caroline with a sneer that transformed his face into something ugly and unfamiliar. "Good. Let them learn early what kind of woman their mother really is. Let them understand why decent folks cross the street when they see us coming." The words hit Caroline like physical blows, each one designed to strip away another piece of her dignity, her sense of self-worth, her hope for something better. This was Roy's true genius for cruelty, the way he could use words to inflict damage that lasted long after bruises faded. He knew exactly where to strike to cause the most pain, had mapped every weakness and vulnerability through years of patient destruction. But tonight, something deep inside Caroline stirred in response to his attack. Perhaps it was the sight of her children trembling beneath their blanket, or perhaps it was simply that she had absorbed all the punishment she was capable of bearing. For just a moment, her spine straightened, and she met his gaze directly. "I have been a faithful wife to you, Roy Cutter," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. "Whatever failings I may have, unfaithfulness is not among them. I have endured your accusations and your anger, your fists and your silence, but I will not have you poison my children's minds with lies." The room fell deadly quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause in its eternal dance around the cabin walls. Roy's face went through several transformations, surprise giving way to disbelief, then to a rage so pure and focused that Caroline immediately regretted her moment of defiance. But it was too late to take back the words, and perhaps too late for anything except the consequences that were surely coming. In the distance, a wolf howled, long and mournful, as though mourning for something that was about to be lost forever in the valley's endless snow. Part 3. The weight of silence. The blow came swift and merciless. Roy's open hand connecting with Caroline's cheek with a sound like thunder splitting the night. She stumbled backward, her hips striking the edge of the rough wooden table, sending waves of pain through her already battered body. The metallic taste of blood bloomed in her mouth, and stars danced at the edges of her vision. From their bed came Emma's sharp intake of breath, quickly muffled, and the soft sound of Luke beginning to cry despite his sister's desperate attempts to keep him quiet. Roy stood over Caroline, his chest heaving with the exertion of his rage, his eyes blazing with a satisfaction that chilled her more than the winter wind. "You will not speak to me that way in my own house," he said, his voice deadly calm now that he had re-established his dominance. "You will not question my judgment or defend your shameful behavior. Do you understand me?" Caroline nodded slowly, one hand pressed to her stinging cheek, tasting salt and copper on her tongue. But even as she submitted to his authority, she felt something hardening inside her chest, a small coal of defiance that his violence could not entirely extinguish. She had spoken the truth, and no amount of punishment could make it less true. Roy seemed to sense her inner resistance, and it infuriated him further. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into flesh that would bloom with new bruises by morning, and shook her like a rag doll. "I said, do you understand me?" "Yes," she whispered, the word torn from her throat like a confession extracted under torture. But her submission only seemed to whet his appetite for more. Roy's hands moved to her throat, not squeezing hard enough to cut off her air entirely, but enough to make each breath a conscious effort, a reminder of how completely he controlled even her most basic functions. "The whole town's talking," he hissed, his whiskey breath hot against her face. Roy Cutter can't even manage his own wife, they're saying. Roy Cutter's woman makes eyes at every man in the valley while he's out trying to make an honest living. Do you know what that does to a man's reputation? Do you know what it costs me? The valley held its breath beneath a blanket of snow so thick that even the wolves seemed to whisper their songs. Caroline Muelle pressed her swollen cheek against the cold window of her cabin, watching the white world beyond through eyes that had learned to see beauty even through pain. The glass fogged with each careful breath, and she traced a small heart in the condensation before quickly wiping it away. Such small joys were dangerous things in Roy Cutter's house. Her two children, Emma and Luke, sat hunched over a wooden puzzle their grandfather had carved years ago, back when laughter still echoed through these walls. Emma, barely 8 but wise beyond her seasons, kept one protective arm around her younger brother while her small fingers worked the pieces into place. Luke's hands trembled slightly as he tried to fit a wooden horse into its proper spot, his concentration fierce and desperate, as though completing this simple task might somehow fix the broken things around him. The cabin itself seemed to sag with the weight of too many harsh winters and harder words. Built by Caroline's father with dreams of prosperity, it now stood as a monument to hopes deferred. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the wind found every gap in the chinking. But Caroline had learned to make do. She had learned to make do with many things that once would have seemed impossible to bear. In the distance, smoke rose from other cabins scattered throughout the valley, each one a small fortress against the wilderness. The settlers of Dry Creek had carved their lives from this harsh land with determination and faith, believing that hard work and decent hearts would see them through any trial. Caroline had once believed that too, back when her father rocked her on the porch and told her stories of brave women who conquered prairies and built empires from nothing but will and love. Those days felt like someone else's memories now. Faded photographs from a life that might have belonged to a different woman entirely. When Roy Cutter had come courting with his easy smile and promises of security, her father had already passed, leaving her alone with dreams too big for a woman without protection in this unforgiving country. Roy had seemed like salvation then, broad-shouldered and confident. Speaking of cattle herds and expansion, of building something lasting together, the first time he raised his hand to her had been 3 months after their wedding, when she dared to question the money he spent at Sullivan's saloon while their pantry grew thin. The shock of it had been almost as painful as the blow itself. The sudden understanding that the man she had trusted with her future was capable of such casual cruelty. But Roy had apologized afterward, had wept genuine tears, and sworn on his mother's grave that it would never happen again. Only it did happen again. And again, and again, until Caroline learned that apologies were just another kind of storm that passed through, leaving devastation in their wake. She learned to read the signs in his face, the tightening around his eyes when drink and frustration mixed into something dangerous. She learned to keep Emma and Luke close during those times, learned to absorb his rage like a lightning rod, drawing the violence to herself and away from the innocent souls she was determined to protect. The people of Dry Creek knew, of course. In a settlement of barely 200 souls, secrets were as rare as rain in August. But knowing and acting were different things entirely. And Caroline had discovered that the frontier code that demanded men protect their own also demanded that others not interfere with family matters. No matter how brutal those matters became, Sheriff Jenkins wore his badge like a decoration rather than a responsibility, more concerned with keeping the peace between himself and the bottle than between husbands and wives. The women of the town clucked their tongues and whispered their theories, some blaming Caroline for not leaving, others suggesting she had brought such treatment upon herself through some unnamed failing. The men simply looked away, uncomfortable with a reality that challenged their notion of how decent folk behaved as evening shadows stretched across the snow. Caroline began preparing what meager supper their stores allowed. Salt pork and cornbread again, stretched thin but seasoned with the love she poured into everything she touched for her children. Emma helped without being asked, her small hands competent with tasks no child should have to master. Luke stayed close, his wide eyes following his mother's every movement, as though memorizing her face against some future loss he sensed but could not name. The sound of heavy boots crunching through snow made all three of them freeze. Caroline's hand instinctively moved to the fading bruises on her throat, hidden beneath a high collar, but still tender to the touch. Roy was coming home, and the particular rhythm of his steps told her everything she needed to know about the state he was in. The saloon had been good to him today, and that goodness would translate into something terrible for them. She quickly ushered the children toward their small bed in the corner, knowing that the less visible they were, the safer they would be. Emma understood immediately, gathering Luke into her arms and pulling a quilt over both their heads. Caroline smoothed her dress, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to meet whatever storm was about to break through that door. The latch rattled, and Roy Cutter stumbled inside, bringing the cold and the stench of whiskey with him. His eyes were bright with drink and something darker, scanning the room like a predator assessing his territory. Caroline stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of her, waiting for his mood to declare itself. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Tonight felt like the kind of night when everything changed, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. In the silence that stretched between them, Caroline found herself thinking of her father's stories again, of brave women who faced impossible odds with nothing but courage and faith. She had no way of knowing that 20 miles away, a man named Jediah Boone was loading supplies onto his pack horse, preparing for a journey that would alter the course of all their lives forever. Part 2. Words. Like weapons, Roy Cutter swayed in the doorway, his bulk blocking out the last traces of winter twilight. Snow clung to his beard like silver whiskers, and his breath came in visible puffs that carried the sour tang of cheap whiskey and cheaper tobacco. Caroline remained motionless, a statue carved from years of learned caution, watching his face for the telltale signs that would determine how this evening would unfold. Caroline wanted to tell him that his reputation had been destroyed long before she ever spoke to Timothy Henderson. The people of Dry Creek whispered about his drinking and his violence, his failure to provide properly for his family, his tendency to start fights he couldn't finish. But she had learned that the truth was a luxury she could not afford, not when her children's safety hung in the balance. "I'm sorry," she managed to whisper around the pressure on her throat. "I didn't mean to embarrass you." "Sorry don't fix what's broken," Roy snarled, but his grip loosened slightly. "Sorry don't make the men stop laughing behind my back or the women stop clucking their tongues like a bunch of hens. You've made me a laughingstock, Caroline, and that's not something that gets forgiven easy." He released her throat and stepped back, leaving her gasping and swaying on her feet. Caroline steadied herself against the table, her free hand still pressed to her burning cheek, watching him pace back and forth across the small cabin like a caged animal. "There's going to be changes around here," Roy announced, his voice carrying the authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "No more trips to town without me. No more talking to other men, for any reason. You'll speak when spoken to and keep your eyes down like a proper wife should." Caroline felt the walls of her world shrinking, becoming a prison so small she could barely breathe within its confines. She thought of her brief conversations with Mrs. Henderson at the general store, of the few moments of human connection that had sustained her through the darkest days. Even those small mercies were to be stripped away now, leaving her more isolated than ever. "The children need," she began, but Roy cut her off with a sharp gesture. "The children need a mother who remembers her place," he said. "They need to see what happens when a woman forgets herself and starts thinking she's better than she is. Maybe watching you learn some humility will teach them lessons they won't soon forget." From the bed came a small sob that Luke could no longer contain, and Emma's whispered attempts to comfort him. Roy's gaze swung toward them, and Caroline felt terror grip her heart like an icy fist. She had always been able to absorb his violence, to serve as a buffer between his rage and the children. But if he turned his attention to them now— "Please," she said, the word escaping before she could stop it. "They're frightened. Let me settle them for the night." Roy studied her for a long moment, his eyes calculating, then nodded slowly. "Go on, then. But remember what I've told you. Things are going to be different from now on. You step out of line again, and it won't just be your face that pays the price." Caroline moved carefully toward the children's bed, every muscle in her body screaming with pain and exhaustion. Emma's eyes were wide and bright with unshed tears, but she maintained her protective hold on Luke, whose small body shook with suppressed sobs. Caroline knelt beside them, gathering both children into her arms. Feeling their desperate need for comfort war with their fear of drawing more attention from their stepfather. "Hush now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Try to sleep. Everything will be better in the morning." But even as she spoke the words, Caroline knew they were lies. Tomorrow would bring the same fear, the same walking on eggshells, the same careful navigation of Roy's unpredictable moods. And now it would be worse, with new restrictions and new punishments waiting for any transgression. Real or imagined, Roy settled into his chair by the fire, pulling out a bottle he had hidden somewhere and taking long swallows that only fueled his brooding anger. Caroline stayed with the children until their breathing deepened into the exhausted sleep of the innocent, then slowly rose and began preparing for bed herself. But sleep would not come easily tonight. As she lay on the narrow cot that served as her bed, listening to Roy's drunken muttering and the wind howling around the cabin walls, Caroline felt the last of her hope beginning to flicker like a candle in the storm. She had tried so hard to be a good wife, a good mother, to find some way to make peace with the life that had been forced upon her. But Roy's need to control and diminish her seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, fed by his own failures and insecurities until it consumed everything else in the darkness. She pressed her hand to her bruised cheek and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to be free, to walk through town with her head held high, to speak to whomever she pleased, to live without the constant fear that any word or gesture might trigger another explosion of violence. But such dreams were dangerous things, more likely to drive her mad than to provide any real comfort. Caroline had learned to survive by accepting her reality, by finding small moments of joy within the confines of her prison. Tomorrow she would wake and tend to her children, would prepare Roy's meals and endure his moods, would continue the careful dance that kept their fragile world from completely falling apart. What she could not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, was that change was already coming to their valley, carried on the boots of a mountain man who had heard enough whispered stories to stir something deep and immutable in his soul. Part 4. The Breaking Point. 3. Weeks passed in a haze of enforced silence and watchful fear. Caroline moved through her days like a ghost, haunting her own life, speaking only when directly addressed, keeping her eyes downcast whenever she encountered another human soul. Roy had made good on his threats, accompanying her on every necessary trip to town, standing close enough to monitor every word she spoke, every glance she exchanged with the merchants and neighbors who had once offered her small kindnesses. The children had grown quieter too, sensing the change in their home's atmosphere. Emma took on more responsibilities without being asked, helping with cooking and mending while keeping Luke close and entertained. At 8 years old, She had developed an intuitive understanding of when to speak and when to disappear, when to draw attention away from her mother and when to simply become invisible. Luke, barely 5, could not understand why Mama no longer sang while she worked, why her smiles had become so rare and fragile. He clung to Emma with the desperate trust of a child who sensed that his world had become a dangerous place, but could not name the source of the danger. The winter had been particularly harsh this year, with storms that seemed to stretch on for days, trapping them all within the cabin's confines. Roy's drinking had increased with his enforced idleness, and with it, his capacity for finding fault with everything Caroline did or failed to do. The coffee was too weak or too strong, the meals too simple or too elaborate, her voice too soft or too loud. She could not win, could not find the narrow path that might lead to peace. But it was not until the morning she found Luke burning with fever that Caroline's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She discovered him as she was preparing breakfast, his small body radiating heat like a coal from the fire. His cheeks were flushed bright red, and his breathing came in quick, shallow pants that terrified her more than all of Roy's threats combined. Emma knelt beside the bed, her young face etched with worry as she bathed her brother's forehead with a damp cloth. "How long has he been like this?" Caroline asked, pressing the back of her hand to Luke's burning skin. "Since before dawn," Emma whispered. "He was talking strange things, Mama, about angels and Papa Roy being a big black bear." Caroline's heart clenched with fear. Fevers in children could turn deadly with frightening speed, especially when proper medical care was scarce. Doc Morrison lived 15 miles away in the next valley, a journey that would take hours in good weather and might be impossible in the current conditions. But she had to try. Roy emerged from the back room, pulling suspenders over his undershirt, already scowling at the disruption to his morning routine. "What's all the whispering about?" he demanded. "Luke's sick," Caroline said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "He's burning up with fever. I need to get him to Doc Morrison." Roy moved closer, glancing down at the boy with the detached interest he might show a sick animal. Kid's always coming down with something. Probably just needs to sweat it out. "No," Caroline said, and the firmness in her own voice surprised her. "This is different. He needs a doctor, Roy. He needs medicine." Roy's eyes narrowed at her tone, at the implicit challenge to his authority. "He needs what I say he needs. And what he needs is for his mother to stop fussing over every little sniffle like it's the end of the world." Caroline stared at him, seeing in his face the same stubborn pride that had cost them so much over the years. Roy would rather risk Luke's life than admit that someone else might know better than he did. Would rather let the boy suffer than appear weak by seeking help. "Please," she said, abandoning pride in favor of desperate honesty. "I'm begging you, Roy, let me take him to town. Let me get help." "You're not taking that boy anywhere," Roy said flatly. "And you're not going to town without me, remember? We discussed your traveling habits." The callousness of his response, the casual way he dismissed their child's suffering in favor of his own controlling needs, broke something fundamental inside Caroline's chest. For years, she had accepted his cruelty toward her as the price of keeping peace, had absorbed his violence and his contempt as a form of protection for Emma and Luke. But this was different. This was about more than her own dignity or safety. "He could die," she said, her voice rising despite every instinct screaming at her to remain calm. "Do you understand that? Your own son could die while you stand there worried about your pride." Roy's face went very still, and Caroline knew she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. But Luke's labored breathing filled the silence between them, and she found that she no longer cared about the consequences of her defiance. "He is not my son," Roy said quietly. his words falling into the room like stones into still water. Neither of them are. They're just reminders of the man who had you before me, who probably got a better woman than I did. The cruelty of it took Caroline's breath away. Roy had known when he married her that she was a widow, that Emma and Luke were the children of her first husband. He had claimed to love them, had promised to raise them as his own. But now, when they needed him most, he revealed the resentment he had carried all along. "They are children," Caroline whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of her anguish. "Innocent children who have done nothing but love you and try to please you. How can you be so heartless?" Roy stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over the bed where Luke lay burning with fever. "I can be whatever I need to be to keep order in my house. And what I need right now is for my wife to remember her place and stop making demands." Caroline looked down at Luke's flushed face, at Emma's frightened eyes, and felt something crystallize inside her chest. For years, she had bent and yielded, had sacrificed pieces of herself on the altar of Roy's need for dominance. But this was her line in the sand, the boundary she could not cross. "No," she said simply. The word hung in the air between them, small but absolute. Roy blinked, as though he had misheard her. "What did you say?" "I said no." Caroline's voice was steadier now, strengthened by a conviction that surprised them both. "I will not let this child suffer because of your pride. I will not watch him burn up with fever while you play games with our lives." Roy's face flushed with rage, and his hand moved instinctively toward her. But Caroline did not flinch. She had found something inside herself that was stronger than fear, stronger than the learned helplessness of years under his control. "You will regret this," Roy said, his voice low and dangerous. "When I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd kept your mouth shut and your place." But Caroline was already moving, gathering Luke into her arms despite his protests of pain, wrapping him in blankets while Emma scrambled to help. She had made her choice, and whatever came next, she would face it knowing that she had finally put her children's needs above her own safety. The storm outside seemed to have intensified, wind howling around the cabin walls like a living thing determined to break in. But Caroline no longer cared about the weather, about the dangerous journey ahead, about Roy's threats or the town's judgment. She cared only about the burning child in her arms and the knowledge that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost. As she prepared to venture into the blizzard, Caroline could not have known that her desperate journey would set in motion events that would change everything, that her moment of defiance would echo across the valley and reach the ears of a man who had been waiting for just such a call to action. Part 5. The mountain man's oath Boone had always been a man of few words and fewer attachments. The mountains had taught him that solitude was a form of strength, that a man who needed nothing from others could never be disappointed by their failures. For 15 years, he had lived alone in his cabin, high above the tree line, trapping and hunting, trading pelts for the bare necessities of survival, wanting nothing more than the harsh honesty of wind and stone and snow. But even the most determined hermit could not entirely escape the reach of human suffering, especially when that suffering traveled on the tongues of traders and trappers, who occasionally shared his fire during their journeys through the high country. Stories had a way of accumulating around remote places, drawn like iron filings to a magnet, and over the past year, Jedediah had heard the same tale repeated with disturbing frequency. A woman in the valley below, beaten and broken by a husband who seemed to take pleasure in her pain. Children who flinched at shadows, who had learned to make themselves small and silent to survive. A man named Roy Cutter, whose cruelty had become legend among the scattered settlements, whose violence was whispered about in saloons and trading posts throughout the territory. Jedediah had listened to these stories with the same detached interest he might show a weather report, filing them away as information about the world he had chosen to leave behind. But something had changed 3 days ago when Samuel Hartley, a trapper heading north from Dry Creek, had stopped at Jediah's cabin seeking shelter from a particularly vicious storm. Samuel had been drunk on whiskey and loneliness, eager to share every piece of gossip he had gathered during his week in town. Most of it had been the usual mix of petty scandals and small-town drama. But one story had cut through Jediah's indifference like a blade through butter. "Saw Caroline Lele in Henderson's store," Samuel had said, his words slurring slightly as he stared into the fire. Poor woman looked like she'd been trampled by horses. Face all bruised up, moving like every step hurt. But the worst part was her eyes, Jediah. Like something had been broken inside her that couldn't be fixed. Jediah had said nothing, but something had twisted in his chest, a recognition that caught him off guard. He had seen those same broken eyes in his own reflection once years ago, after his own world had collapsed around him. "Henderson's boy tried to help her with her packages," Samuel continued. "Just being polite, you know? But when Roy Cutter saw them talking, he backhanded that woman right there in front of God and everybody. Then he dragged her out of the store by her hair, telling anyone who'd listened that his wife needed to learn some manners." The story had lodged itself in Jediah's mind like a splinter, working its way deeper with each passing hour. He found himself thinking about the woman's eyes, about the children who must have witnessed such treatment, about a town full of people who apparently found it easier to gossip than to act. He had tried to dismiss these thoughts as weakness, as the kind of emotional entanglement he had sworn to avoid. But the mountains had their own way of testing a man's resolve. And when the blizzard had trapped him in his cabin for 3 days with nothing but his own conscience for company, Jediah had been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. He was not, despite his best efforts, as indifferent to human suffering as he pretended to be. The stories of Caroline Mully's treatment had awakened something in him that years of solitude had not managed to kill. A sense of justice that demanded action regardless of the personal cost. On the morning when the storm finally broke, Jediah had made his decision. He loaded his pack with supplies, cleaned and oiled his rifle, and set out down the mountain toward Dry Creek. He told himself he was only going to observe, to see if the stories were true, but deep in his heart he knew he was lying. He was going to war, though against what enemy he could not yet say. The journey down from his cabin normally took half a day, but the deep snow and treacherous conditions stretched it into a full day's hard travel. By the time he reached the outskirts of Dry Creek, night had fallen, and the town was settling into the quiet routine of winter evening. Smoke rose from chimneys, lamplight flickered behind curtained windows, and the whole scene had the deceptive peace of a picture in a storybook. But Jediah had learned long ago that appearances could be deadly deceptions, that the most beautiful landscapes often hid the deadliest traps. He made camp in a grove of pines just outside town, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid unwanted attention. Tomorrow he would learn the truth about Caroline Lele and her children, would see for himself whether intervention was necessary. What he could not have predicted was that Caroline herself would make that decision for him. He was awakened before dawn by the sound of someone struggling through the snow, moving with the desperate determination of a person fleeing disaster. Jediah rolled silently from his bedroll, rifle in hand, and peered through the trees toward the source of the disturbance. A woman emerged from the swirling snow, carrying a small child wrapped in blankets, with an older girl clinging to her skirt. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, Jediah could see that she was barely managing to stay on her feet, stumbling and weaving like someone at the end of their endurance. The child in her arms was clearly ill, his small body limp and unresponsive. Caroline Lele had left her cabin in the middle of a blizzard, risking everything to get help for her sick boy. As Jediah watched her struggle through snow that reached nearly to her waist, watched her fall and struggle back to her feet again and again. He felt the last of his hesitation burn away like fog before the sun. He emerged from the trees without a sound, moving with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to become part of the landscape itself. Caroline saw him coming and froze, clutching Luke tighter to her chest, her eyes wide with a terror that spoke of too many encounters with dangerous men. "Easy," Jedediah said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the wind. "I'm not going to hurt you." He could see her calculating her chances, weighing the threat he represented against the need to get help for her child. Emma pressed closer to her mother's side, her young face set in lines of premature protective instincts. "The boy's sick," Jedediah observed, and it was not a question. He could see the feverish flush on the small face, could recognize the particular desperation that drove a mother to venture into a killing storm. "Doc Morrison's 15 miles through this weather. You'll never make it on foot." Caroline's lips trembled, whether from cold or exhaustion or the crushing weight of her helplessness. Jedediah could not say. "I have to try," she whispered. "Roy won't let me take the wagon. Says Luke just needs to sweat it out. But he's burning up, and I can't just watch him die." The simple honesty of her words, the way she spoke of defying her husband's will as though it were a death sentence she had chosen to accept, confirmed everything Jedediah had heard about her situation. But more than that, it revealed a strength he had not expected, a fierce maternal love that had finally overcome years of learned submission. "My horse is strong," Jedediah said simply. "He can carry all of you to town." Caroline stared at him as though he had offered her the moon itself. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Jedediah was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the growing light. He saw the bruises that makeup could not entirely hide, the way she held herself as though expecting another blow, the protective way she cradled her sick child. But he also saw something else, something that reminded him of a person he had once been, before the world had taught him that caring was just another word for suffering. "Because someone should," he said finally. It was not much of an explanation, but it was the only truth he could offer. The journey to town took 3 hours through snow. That seemed determined to bury them all. Jedediah's horse, a sturdy mountain-bred gelding named Goliath, plowed through drifts that would have stopped lesser animals, while Jedediah himself broke trail on foot, his long legs and wilderness knowledge finding the safest path through the treacherous terrain. Caroline rode behind him, Luke bundled against her chest, while Emma clung to her mother's waist with the determination of a child who understood that this strange man represented their only hope. None of them spoke during the journey, but Jedediah was acutely aware of Caroline's presence behind him, of the way her body trembled with exhaustion and fear, of the soft sounds she made when Luke's condition seemed to worsen Doc by the time they reached Doc Morrison's house on the edge of Dry Creek. The storm had intensified again, turning the world into a white void that swallowed sound and sight alike. Jedediah pounded on the doctor's door with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. And when the elderly physician appeared in his nightgown, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Jedediah simply stepped aside to reveal Caroline and her children. Doc Morrison took one look at Luke's condition and ushered them all inside, his professional instincts overriding any questions about how they had managed to travel through such weather. Within minutes, Luke was settled in a warm bed, the doctor's experienced hands checking his pulse and temperature while Caroline hovered nearby, her face etched with worry. "Pneumonia," Doc Morrison announced after his examination. "But we caught it early enough. He'll need medicine and rest, and someone to watch him closely for the next few days. The crisis should break within 48 hours if we're lucky." Caroline sagged with relief, tears streaming down her face as the doctor began preparing treatments. But even as the immediate danger passed, Jedediah could see new worries forming in her eyes. She had defied Roy to bring Luke here, had abandoned her home and her husband's authority to save her child's life. There would be consequences for such defiance, consequences that might prove more dangerous than any fever dot, as if reading his thoughts. Carolyn turned to him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and terror. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, "but I don't know what happens now. Roy he'll be furious that I left without permission, that I brought Luke here despite his orders." Jediah studied her face, seeing in it the same trapped desperation he had witnessed in wounded animals, creatures caught between predators and precipices with no safe path to follow. He thought of the stories he had heard, of a woman beaten for speaking to a store clerk, of children who lived in constant fear of their stepfather's moods. "What will you do?" he asked. Caroline looked down at Luke, already breathing easier under the doctor's care, then at Emma, who had fallen asleep in a chair despite her determination to stay vigilant. "I suppose I'll go home and face whatever comes," she said, with a resignation that cut Jediah to the bone. "What else can I do? I have nowhere else to go, no money of my own, no family to take us in. Roy owns everything, controls everything. Without him, we have nothing." The acceptance in her voice, the way she spoke of returning to certain punishment as though it were an unchangeable law of nature, sparked something fierce and protective in Jediah's chest. He had come down from the mountains to observe, perhaps to intervene if necessary. But this woman's quiet courage in the face of impossible choices had changed everything. "You don't have to go back," he heard himself saying, though he had not planned the words. "Not tonight. Maybe not ever, if you don't want to." Caroline's eyes widened, and for a moment, hope flickered there like a candle flame in a dark room. But then reality reasserted itself, and she shook her head sadly. "You don't understand," she said. "Roy won't just let us disappear. He'll come looking, and when he finds us, the law won't protect me from my own husband. No one will stand against him, not for someone like me." Jediah was quiet for a long moment, considering her words and the truth they contained. She was right, of course. The frontier had its own codes of justice, and those codes rarely favored women who defied their husband's authority. Sheriff Jenkins was weak and corrupt, more interested in avoiding trouble than confronting it. The townspeople might whisper about Roy's cruelty, but they would not risk their own safety to oppose him. But Caroline had not considered one possibility, one factor that might change the entire equation of her situation. She had not considered what might happen when Roy Cutter finally encountered someone who was not afraid of him, someone who had his own code of justice and the strength to enforce it. "Let me worry about Roy," Jediah said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that made Caroline look at him sharply. "You just focus on getting your boy well and deciding what kind of life you want for yourself and your children." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Doc Morrison's warm house, something had shifted in the balance of power that had ruled Caroline's world for so long. She did not yet dare to believe that escape was possible, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what freedom might look like, and 20 miles away, in a cabin growing cold without a fire to tend it, Roy Cutter was discovering that his wife and children were gone, along with his absolute control over their lives. His rage, when it came, would be terrible to behold, but it would also be the beginning of his downfall. Part 6. The reckoning begins. Roy Cutter's roar of fury shook the cabin walls when he discovered the empty bed and cold hearth that morning. Snow had blown in through the door. Caroline had left ajar in her desperate flight, creating small drifts across the rough plank floor that told the story of her escape more clearly than any written confession. The sight of those wind-carved patterns filled Roy with a rage so pure and consuming that he swept everything from the kitchen table with one violent motion, sending tin plates and cups clattering across the room. She had defied him. After years of careful training After countless lessons taught with fist and fury, Caroline had dared to disobey his direct orders and flee into the storm with those children. The magnitude of her rebellion struck him like a physical blow, not just because of what she had done, but because of what it represented: the complete collapse of his authority over his own household. Roy dressed quickly, his movements sharp and aggressive as he pulled on boots and coat, his mind already racing through the implications of Caroline's flight. By now, half the town would know that Roy Cutter's wife had left him, had taken her children, and disappeared into the night like a thief stealing away with stolen goods. The whispers would have already started. The knowing looks and barely concealed smirks of people who had long waited for exactly this kind of humiliation to befall him. But it was not too late to salvage the situation. Not if he acted quickly and decisively. Caroline could not have gone far in such weather. Not on foot with a sick child and a young girl to slow her down. She would have sought shelter somewhere, probably with one of the bleeding heart families in town who'd always looked at him with barely concealed disapproval. Once he found her, once he dragged her home and made it clear that such behavior would never be tolerated again, the gossips would have to find someone else to whisper about. Roy saddled his horse with rough efficiency, jerking the cinch tight enough to make the animal sidestep nervously. The storm had lessened during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by deep snow and bitter cold. But the roads were still passable for a man determined enough to brave them. As he rode toward town, Roy's anger crystallized into a cold, calculating fury that was far more dangerous than any heated outburst. Caroline would pay for this humiliation, but not with the quick violence of his usual punishments. This betrayal demanded something more lasting, more complete. When he brought her home, she would learn that defiance carried consequences beyond anything she had yet experienced. And if the children had encouraged her rebellion, well, they would learn their own lessons about the price of disloyalty. Doc Morrison's house stood on the outskirts of Dry Creek, a modest clapboard structure that had served the community's medical needs for more than 20 years. Roy spotted the smoke rising from its chimney from half a mile away, and something in his gut told him he had found his quarry. Caroline would have brought the boy here if she truly believed he was sick, would have risked everything on the old doctor's ability to provide help that Roy himself could not. He dismounted outside the house, noting the tracks in the snow that confirmed his suspicions. Multiple sets of footprints led to the front door, including some that were far too large to belong to Caroline or her children. Someone had helped her reach town, someone with the size and strength to travel through the storm. The realization that his wife's rebellion had been aided by another man added a new dimension to Roy's rage. A personal element that transformed this from a domestic matter into something much more serious. Roy pounded on the door with enough force to rattle the frame. And when Doc Morrison answered, the older man's face immediately tightened with wariness. The doctor had treated enough of Roy's victims over the years to know exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Had seen the results of his handiwork on Caroline's face and body too many times to harbor any illusions about his character. "Where is she?" Roy demanded without preamble, pushing past the doctor into the warm interior of the house. "Mr. Cutter," Doc Morrison said carefully, "if you're referring to your wife, she came here seeking medical attention for young Luke. The boy has pneumonia, and he needs... I don't care what the boy needs." Roy snarled, his eyes scanning the room for signs of his family. "I care about my wife running off in the middle of the night like some kind of common criminal. Where are they?" Doc Morrison drew himself up to his full height, which was still several inches shorter than Roy, but somehow seemed more substantial in the close confines of his own home. "They are under my medical care, Mr. Cutter. Mrs. Cutter brought Luke here in the nick of time. A few more hours, and we might have lost him." The words struck Roy like a slap, carrying the implication that his judgment had been wrong. that Caroline's defiance had actually been necessary to save the boy's life. But rather than feeling any relief or gratitude, Roy found his anger intensifying, fed by the humiliation of being proven wrong by the very woman he had spent years teaching to doubt her own instincts. "That boy is my responsibility," Roy said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My wife is my responsibility. And I'll thank you to remember that when you're deciding who gets to make decisions in my family." Doc Morrison's eyes hardened, and for a moment the two men faced each other across a divide that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with fundamentally different ideas about power and responsibility. The doctor had seen too much suffering in his long career to be easily intimidated, and watched too many women bear the consequences of their husband's pride to remain silent in the face of such callous disregard for a child's welfare. "Your family is welcome to stay here as long as necessary," Doc Morrison said firmly. "Luke needs careful monitoring for the next 48 hours, and Mrs. Cutter needs rest after her ordeal. I would suggest you focus on being grateful that your son is alive, rather than angry about the circumstances that saved him." Roy's face flushed with rage at the gentle rebuke, at the suggestion that he should be grateful for his wife's disobedience. But before he could respond, footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Caroline appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. She wore a borrowed dress that hung loose on her thin frame, and her hair was braided simply down her back. But there was something different about her bearing, something that suggested the desperate flight through the storm had changed more than just her location. "Roy," she said quietly, and her voice carried none of the automatic deference he had come to expect. "Luke is sleeping. The fever broke an hour ago." Roy stared at his wife, noting the way she stood straighter than usual, the way her eyes met his directly rather than sliding away in practiced submission. The change was subtle but unmistakable, and it filled him with a cold fury that had nothing to do with her disobedience and everything to do with the recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power between them. "Get your things," he said, his voice deadly calm. "We're going home, now." Caroline did not move, did not even flinch at the menace in his tone. "Luke needs to stay here until he's stronger." "Doc Morrison says—" "I don't care what Doc Morrison says." Roy cut her off, stepping closer until he loomed over her smaller frame. "I care about my wife learning to follow orders instead of running off every time she gets a notion in her head." The threat in his posture was unmistakable, the promise of violence that had always been his ultimate argument in any dispute. But Caroline did not back down, did not assume the apologetic stance that had once signaled her surrender to his will. "No," she said simply, and the word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Roy blinked, certain he had misheard her. "What did you say?" "I said no." Caroline's voice was stronger now, fed by a conviction that surprised them both. "I will not take a sick child out into the cold because of your pride. I will not risk Luke's life to satisfy your need for control." The silence that followed was deafening, charged with the electricity of a fundamental challenge to everything Roy believed about his place in the world. Doc Morrison watched tensely from the corner, ready to intervene if necessary, while upstairs Emma listened through the floorboards, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope. Roy's hand moved instinctively toward Caroline, the automatic response of a man accustomed to ending arguments with violence. But before he could complete the motion, another voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." All three of them turned toward the back door, where a figure had appeared with the silent suddenness of a shadow giving form. Jediah Boone stood in the doorway, snow still clinging to his broad shoulders, his presence filling the small room like a force of nature. His eyes were fixed on Roy with the unwavering intensity of a predator studying its prey, and his hand rested casually near the knife at his belt. Roy's face went through several rapid transformations as he processed this new development. Here was the man who had helped Caroline escape, the interfering stranger who had enabled her rebellion and turned his private family matter into a public humiliation. The rage that had been building in Roy's chest for hours finally found a suitable target, someone he could strike without worrying about the consequences. "Yeah," Roy snarled, turning away from Caroline to face this new threat. "I should have known. Can't mind your own business, can you, mountain man? Have to come sniffing around another man's wife like some kind of scavenger." Jedediah's expression did not change, but something cold and dangerous flickered in his dark eyes. "I came to check on the boy," he said calmly. "Make sure he was recovering properly." "The boy is none of your concern," Roy shot back, his voice rising with each word. "Neither is my wife. You've got no business here, no right to interfere in my family's affairs." "Maybe not," Jedediah agreed, his voice remaining level despite the tension crackling through the room. "But someone needed to help, and it seems like you weren't interested in doing it yourself." The words hit Roy like a physical blow, carrying all the judgment and condemnation that the mountain man's calm tone tried to conceal. Here was everything Roy hated about the whispered criticisms he endured in town. The suggestion that he was failing as a husband and father, that his authority was built on cruelty rather than respect. "You think you know something about my family?" Roy demanded, taking a step toward Jedediah. "You think hiding up in the mountains makes you some kind of judge of how decent folks live?" Jedediah finally moved, shifting his weight slightly so that he stood between Roy and Caroline, his presence serving as both barrier and warning. "I think a man who'd rather see a child suffer than admit he might be wrong isn't much of a man at all." The insult hung in the air between them, carefully calculated to provoke exactly the response Jedediah was expecting. Roy's face flushed red with fury, and his hand moved to the gun at his hip, but he found himself hesitating at the last moment. There was something in the mountain man's stillness that suggested violence would be met with swift and overwhelming force, something that warned Roy he might be biting off more than he could chew, but retreat was impossible now. Not with Caroline watching, not with Doc Morrison bearing witness to his humiliation. Roy had built his entire identity on the fear he inspired in others, and if he backed down now, that carefully constructed image would crumble beyond repair. "This isn't over," Roy said finally, his voice thick with menace. "Not by a long shot. Caroline, you think about what you're doing here. Think about what it costs to defy your husband, what it means for your children's future." With that parting threat, Roy stormed from the house, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. But his departure did not bring relief, only the tense awareness that the conflict had escalated beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Caroline sank into a chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her, while Jedediah remained standing by the door, listening to the sound of Roy's horse disappearing into the distance. The first battle had been won, but the war was just beginning, and all of them knew that Roy Cutter was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. "He'll be back," Caroline whispered, her voice barely audible. "And when he comes, he'll bring others with him. He won't let this stand." Jedediah nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of her words. Roy had too much pride to simply accept his wife's defiance, too much invested in his reputation as a man who controlled his household absolutely. The next confrontation would be more serious, more dangerous, and it would determine once and for all whether Caroline and her children would live as free people or remain prisoners of one man's need for dominance. But as Jedediah looked at Caroline, seeing the quiet strength that had finally begun to emerge from years of suppression, he felt something settle in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of a deep well. He had come down from the mountains to help, but somewhere along the way, their fight had become his fight. Their freedom had become a cause worth whatever sacrifice it might demand. The reckoning Roy had promised was coming, but he would not be the only one prepared for it. Part 7. The storm breaks. Word of the confrontation at dock. Morrison's house spread through Dry Creek like wildfire in dry grass. By noon, every woman in town knew that Caroline Lilly had defied her husband to save her child's life. And every man knew that Roy Cutter had been backed down by the mountain hermit who had helped her escape. The story grew with each telling, gathering details and implications that transformed a simple act of medical necessity into a scandal that would be discussed for years to come. In Henderson's general store, women clustered around barrels of flour and bins of dried beans. Their voices hushed but urgent as they dissected every aspect of the drama. Mrs. Hattie Dillard, the town's unofficial queen of gossip, held court near the bolts of fabric, her sharp eyes bright with the excitement of having fresh material to analyze. "I always said that woman had more spine than she let on," Hattie declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had predicted this outcome all along. "You can only push a person so far before they push back. And Roy Cutter has been asking for a comeuppance for years." But not everyone shared Hattie's enthusiasm for Caroline's rebellion. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, the banker's wife and a pillar of the community's more conservative elements, pursed her lips in disapproval as she examined a bolt of blue calico with more attention than the fabric deserved. "A wife's duty is to obey her husband," Eleanor said primly. Whatever Roy's failings might be, Caroline took vows before God and man to honor and obey him. Running off in the night like some kind of fallen woman reflects poorly on all of us. The comment sparked a heated debate that drew in every woman within earshot, revealing the deep divisions that existed beneath the surface of their small community. Some argued that a mother's duty to her children superseded all other obligations, while others maintained that challenging male authority was a dangerous precedent that could undermine the very foundations of civilized society. Meanwhile, at Sullivan's saloon, the men conducted their own analysis of the situation with the aid of whiskey and tobacco. The general consensus among the drinkers was that Roy had been made to look like a fool, but opinions differed sharply on whether this was a good thing or a dangerous development that threatened the natural order of things. Sheriff Jenkins sat at his usual table, nursing a glass of beer and trying to avoid eye contact with anyone who might expect him to actually do something about the situation. As the town's chief law enforcement officer, he theoretically had a responsibility to maintain order and prevent conflicts from escalating into violence. But Jenkins had spent years perfecting the art of selective blindness when it came to domestic disputes, and he had no intention of changing his policy now. "What's your take on this, Sheriff?" asked Tom Bailey, the blacksmith, a man whose massive arms and straightforward manner made him something of a leader among the working men of the town. "You planning to do anything about Cutter threatening folks at Doc Morrison's place?" Jenkins took a careful sip of his beer, buying time while he formulated a response that would satisfy the questioner, without actually committing him to any specific action. "Family matters are complicated things," he said finally. "Not always clear what the law should or shouldn't do when husband and wife have disagreements." The diplomatic non-answer satisfied no one, but it effectively ended that particular line of questioning. Most of the men in the saloon had little respect for Jenkins anyway, and his obvious reluctance to confront Roy Cutter only confirmed their existing opinions about his cowardice. But while the town debated and gossiped, Roy himself was not idle. His humiliation at Doc Morrison's house had transformed his anger into something colder and more calculated, a fury that demanded not just the return of his property, but the complete destruction of anyone who had dared to challenge his authority. Caroline's defiance was bad enough, but the mountain man's interference had elevated this from a domestic dispute into a personal vendetta that would only be satisfied with blood. Roy spent the afternoon visiting certain establishments in town, places where men gathered who shared his particular views about the proper order of things. The Gold Nugget Saloon catered to a rougher clientele than Sullivan's, attracting drifters and hard cases who lived by codes that had little to do with law and everything to do with strength and intimidation. It was there that Roy found Jake Morrison and Pete Randall, two men whose loyalty could be purchased for the price of a bottle and whose consciences were sufficiently flexible to accommodate almost any request. Jake was a failed prospector whose dreams of striking it rich had been drowned in whiskey and resentment, while Pete was a former ranch hand who had been fired from his last 3 jobs for reasons involving violence and theft. "I need some help with a problem," Roy told him, buying a round of drinks and settling into a corner table where their conversation would not be overheard. "There's a man who's been interfering in my family business, and I think it's time he learned to mind his own affairs." Jake's eyes lit up with interest, while Pete nodded slowly, already understanding the nature of the problem and the kind of solution Roy had in mind. Both men had been in enough similar situations to recognize the signs of a man looking for hired muscle to settle a score he could not handle alone. "What kind of help are you looking for?" Pete asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Just a friendly conversation or something more permanent?" Roy's smile was cold and predatory, carrying all the menace that his words left unspoken. "Let's just say I want him to understand that there are consequences for sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. What happens after that depends on how quickly he learns his lesson." The 3 men spent the next hour working out the details of their plan, a strategy that would allow Roy to reclaim his family while simultaneously eliminating the mountain man who had enabled their escape. By the time they finished their planning, the sun was beginning to set, and the streets of Dry Creek were settling into their evening routines. But 20 miles away, in Doc Morrison's house, a different kind of planning was taking place. Jediah had spent the afternoon studying the approaches to the house, identifying potential defensive positions and escape routes with the methodical attention of a man who had learned that survival often depended on such preparations. He could feel trouble building like pressure before a storm, could sense that Roy's retreat had been temporary rather than permanent. Carolyn sat by Luke's bedside, watching her son sleep peacefully for the first time in days. The fever had broken completely, and Doc Morrison assured her that the boy was well on his way to recovery. But even this good news could not dispel the anxiety that gnawed at her heart. The knowledge that her moment of defiance had set in motion events that might destroy everything she had tried to protect. "He's looking much better," Doc Morrison said quietly, checking Luke's pulse and breathing. "Another day or 2 of rest, and he'll be ready to travel if necessary." The words carried an implication that made Caroline's stomach clench with dread. If Luke could travel, then there would be no medical reason for them to remain under the doctor's protection. Roy would have every legal right to demand their return, and this time he would not be so easily deterred by moral arguments or veiled threats. "What am I going to do?" Carolyn whispered, the question directed as much to herself as to the men who had become her unlikely protectors. "I can't go back to him, not after this. But I can't stay here forever, either. And I have nowhere else to go." Jediah looked up from his position by the window, where he had been watching the street for any sign of Roy's return. His weathered face was thoughtful, as though he were weighing options that others could not see. "There are places," he said finally, "remote places where a person could start over, build a new life away from folks who might cause trouble. It's not easy, and it's not comfortable, but it's possible." Caroline's heart leaped at the suggestion, even as her practical mind cataloged all the reasons why such an escape was impossible. She had no money, no skills beyond those of housekeeping and childcare, no experience of the world beyond the narrow confines of Dry Creek and the surrounding valley. How could she possibly survive in the wilderness with 2 young children to protect and provide for? But before she could voice these objections, The sound of approaching horses cut through the evening quiet. Jedediah moved immediately to the window, his body tensing as he counted the riders moving slowly down the street toward the doctor's house. 4 men, he reported grimly. Roy and 3 others I don't recognize. They're armed, and they're not trying to hide it. Doc Morrison moved quickly to extinguish the lamps, plunging the house into darkness that would make it harder for the approaching men to see inside. Caroline gathered Emma and Luke close, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the house. Outside, the riders stopped directly in front of the house, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold air. Roy's voice carried clearly through the walls, amplified by drink and the confidence that came from having numerical superiority. "I know you're in there, Caroline," he shouted. "You and that mountain trash who thinks he can steal another man's property. Come out now, and maybe we can settle this without anyone getting hurt." The threat was obvious, but so was the lie embedded within it. Roy had not brought 3 armed men to negotiate a peaceful resolution. He had come to take back what he considered his and to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. Jedediah checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready, then positioned himself where he could cover both the front and back entrances to the house. His movements were calm and economical, those of a man who had faced death before and found it less frightening than the alternative of living with cowardice. "Doc," he said quietly, "you and the children need to get to the back room and stay low. This is going to get ugly fast." But Caroline did not move toward safety. Instead, she stood and walked toward the front window, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of absolute crisis. "No more running," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. "No more hiding. If Roy wants to destroy our lives, he'll have to do it in front of witnesses. He'll have to show the whole town exactly what kind of man he really is." Before anyone could stop her, Caroline opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, her slight figure silhouetted against the lamplight from inside. She faced her husband and his hired guns with a composure that came from finally understanding that some things were worth dying for. "I'm here, Roy," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered yard. "But I'm not coming home with you. Not tonight, not ever. Our marriage is over." The words fell into the night like stones into a deep well, final and irrevocable. Behind Caroline, Jedediah appeared in the doorway, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed, his presence serving as both support and warning. Roy's face contorted with rage at this public humiliation, and having his authority challenged in front of the men he had hired to intimidate his enemies. The careful plans he had made dissolved in the face of his fury, replaced by a desire to hurt and destroy that overwhelmed all other considerations. "You think you can make a fool of me?" he snarled, his hand moving to his gun. "You think you can run off with your lover and live happily ever after? Well, I've got news for you, Caroline. Dead women don't get to choose who they belong to." The threat was explicit now. The violence he had always implied finally dragged into the open where everyone could see it clearly. But as Roy drew his weapon, he discovered that he was not the only one prepared for this moment to arrive. Jedediah's rifle came up with the fluid grace of long practice, the barrel finding its target with deadly precision. Around them, the night erupted into chaos as other guns cleared leather and the careful pretense of civilization finally fell away, revealing the savage truths that had always lurked beneath the surface of their small community. The storm that had been building for months was finally breaking, and when it passed, nothing in Dry Creek would ever be the same again. Part 8. Thunder's End. First shot shattered the winter silence like thunder splitting stone. Roy's pistol barked flame and smoke, but his aim was wild, thrown off by whiskey and rage and the unexpected sight of his wife standing defiant before him. The bullet splintered wood from the porch, post inches from Caroline's head, but she did not flinch, did not retreat into the safety of the house. Jedediah's response was swift and precise. The mountain man's rifle speaking with the authority of a man who had never missed a shot that mattered. The bullet took Jake Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle and sending his weapon flying into the snow. The hired gun hit the ground hard, clutching his wounded arm and screaming curses that echoed off the surrounding houses. The sound of gunfire brought people running from every direction, neighbors emerging from their homes with lanterns and weapons. Drawn by the commotion, despite the danger it represented, windows lit up along the street as families peered out to witness the confrontation that had been building for months. The moment when all the whispered gossip and careful avoidance would finally be resolved in blood and smoke. Pete Randall spurred his horse forward, firing wildly at the porch where Caroline and Jedediah stood. But his shots went wide as his mount reared and plunged into chaos. Jedediah worked the lever of his rifle with practiced efficiency, sending another bullet that dropped Pete's horse and pinned the gunman beneath its thrashing body. Roy himself had dismounted, taking cover behind a water trough while he tried to steady his aim for another shot at his wife. But the whiskey that had given him courage now betrayed him, making his hand shake and his vision blur at the crucial moment. His second shot went high, punching through a window of Doc Morrison's house and drawing a sharp cry from inside. "Caroline!" Roy bellowed, his voice cracking with frustration and fury. "This is what you wanted. This is what your defiance has brought us to? Blood in the streets because you couldn't learn your place?" From the shadows across the street, Sheriff Jenkins finally appeared, his badge glinting in the lamplight as he approached the scene with his weapon drawn but pointed safely toward the ground. His face was pale with the realization that he could no longer ignore what was happening in his town, that the violence he had pretended not to see had finally erupted into open warfare that demanded official response. "That's enough," Jenkins shouted, his voice carrying more authority than anyone had heard from him in years. "Drop your weapons, all of you. This ends now." But Roy was beyond hearing reason, beyond responding to any authority, but his own wounded pride. The sight of his wife standing free and unafraid, protected by another man, while half the town watched his humiliation, had pushed him past the point of rational thought. He rose from behind the water trough, his pistol raised toward Caroline with deadly intent. "If I can't have you," he snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger, "then nobody can." The shot that followed was not Roy's. Jedediah's rifle spoke again, the sound rolling across the snowy street like judgment itself. The bullet struck Roy center mass, the impact lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing backward into the snow. His pistol flew from nerveless fingers, spinning away into the darkness as he lay gasping and staring up at the stars that had witnessed his final act of cruelty. Caroline rushed to his side, her healer's instincts overriding years of fear and abuse. She knelt in the bloody snow, pressing her hands against the wound that was already beyond any earthly help. Roy's eyes found hers in the lamplight, wide with surprise and something that might have been regret. "I loved you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of approaching footsteps and urgent voices. "In my own way, I loved you." Caroline looked down at the man who had been both her husband and her tormentor, feeling a complex mixture of grief and relief that she could not entirely untangle. "I know," she said softly. "But love shouldn't hurt like this, Roy. Love shouldn't break what it's meant to protect." Roy's eyes fluttered closed, and his breathing grew shallow and irregular. Within minutes, the man who had ruled Caroline's world through fear and violence was gone, leaving behind only questions about what came next and how to rebuild lives that had been shattered by years of systematic cruelty. The remaining gunman, trapped beneath his fallen horse, had lost all appetite for fighting and raised his hands in surrender. Jake Morrison, clutching his wounded shoulder, was helped to his feet by Doc Morrison and led inside for treatment. The brief, violent confrontation was over, but its consequences would ripple through Dry Creek for years to come. Sheriff Jenkins approached Caroline slowly, his weathered face etched with something that might have been compassion. "Mrs. Cutter," he said formally, "I'm going to need to ask you some questions about what happened here tonight." Caroline nodded, understanding that legal formalities had to be observed even when the truth was obvious to everyone present. But before Jenkins could continue, Tom Bailey the blacksmith stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the sheriff's approach to Caroline. "Seems pretty clear what happened," Tom said, his voice carrying the authority of a man respected throughout the community. "Roy Cutter came here with armed men to threaten his wife and family. When he drew on an unarmed woman, Jediah Boone acted to protect innocent lives. Self-defense, pure and simple." A murmur of agreement rose from the growing crowd of townspeople who had witnessed the confrontation. Mrs. Hattie Dillard pushed through the group, her sharp eyes bright with indignation as she confronted the sheriff. "Everyone knows Roy Cutter was a brute who beat his wife and terrorized those children," she declared. "If you're thinking of charging anyone with wrongdoing here, Jenkins, you'd better think again. This town has tolerated enough of that man's cruelty." Other voices joined the chorus, creating a wall of community support that surprised Caroline with its strength and unanimity. People she had barely spoken to over the years stepped forward to defend her actions and condemn Roy's violence. The whispered conversations that had followed her through town had apparently included more sympathy than judgment, more outrage at her treatment and criticism of her endurance. Sheriff Jenkins looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him and made the calculation that had guided his entire career. Whatever his personal feelings about the situation might be, he lacked both the courage and the community support necessary to pursue charges against Caroline or Jediah. The case would be ruled self-defense, and everyone involved could move on with their lives. "I'll need statements from everyone," he said finally, his voice carrying resignation rather than authority. "But it's clear that Mr. Cutter initiated the violence here tonight. The matter is closed as far as the law is concerned." As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed, Caroline found herself alone with Jediah in the gathering darkness. The mountain man stood quietly beside her, his rifle now resting in the crook of his arm, his presence solid and reassuring in the aftermath of violence. "What happens now?" Caroline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm free, but I don't know how to be free. I don't know where to go or what to do." Jediah was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the same careful attention he gave to reading weather signs or tracking game through difficult terrain. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a promise that would change both their lives forever. "There's a valley about 50 miles north of here," he said slowly. "Good water, sheltered from the worst storms, soil that'll grow most anything if you're willing to work it. Been thinking about building something permanent there, something more than just a trapper's cabin." Caroline looked up at him, seeing in his weathered face not just the offer of sanctuary, but the possibility of something she had never dared to imagine. A partnership built on mutual respect rather than dominance, a life shaped by cooperation rather than fear. "You're asking me to come with you?" she said, wanting to be certain she understood what he was offering. "I'm asking if you'd like to help build something new," Jediah replied. "A place where children can grow up safe, where a woman's voice carries the same weight as a man's, where strength is measured by what you protect rather than what you can destroy." Emma appeared at Caroline's side, having crept out of the house during the confrontation's aftermath. The 8-year-old girl looked up at Jediah with eyes that held both wariness and hope, old enough to understand this moment would determine the course of their entire future. "Would there be room for us too?" Emma asked, her young voice carrying a dignity that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Luke and me, I mean. Would we be welcome in this place you're building? Jedediah knelt down so that he was at Emma's eye level, his expression gentle despite the hardness that wilderness living had carved into his features. Wouldn't be much of a place without young folks to fill it with laughter, he said seriously. Truth is, I've been lonely up there by myself. Could use the company of people who understand what it means to take care of each other. Carolyn felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of relief rather than pain. The future stretched before them, uncertain and challenging, but filled with possibility rather than dread. She thought of Luke sleeping peacefully in Doc Morrison's house, finally free from the fever that had nearly claimed him, and of Emma standing brave and hopeful beside her, ready to embrace whatever came next. Yes, Carolyn said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. Yes, we'd like to help you build something new. As they stood together in the snow-covered street, surrounded by the evidence of the night's violence, but looking toward a future built on different principles entirely, Caroline felt the last chains of her captivity finally fall away. Roy Cutter was dead, but more importantly, the part of herself that had learned to accept cruelty as inevitable was dead too. The mountain man had said, "Enough," and meant it. Now it was time to discover what life looked like when it was built on foundation of choice rather than fear, of partnership rather than domination, of love that healed instead of love that destroyed. 3 months later, as spring began to creep into the high country and the snow retreated to reveal the promise of new growth, Carolyn stood on the porch of a cabin that she had helped to build with her own hands. Luke played in the dooryard with a wooden horse that Jedediah had carved for him, his laughter ringing clear and bright in the mountain air. Emma worked beside her mother, tending seedlings that would become their first garden, a young face bright with the confidence of a child who knew she was valued and protected. And in the distance, Jedediah worked to clear another field, his movements strong and purposeful as he prepared the ground for crops that would sustain them through the coming winter. He had kept his promise, had built them a place where strength served love rather than destroying it, where the future was something to be created rather than endured. Carolyn touched the ring on her finger, the simple band of mountain gold that Jedediah had fashioned to replace the one that Roy had given her so many years ago. This ring carried no weight of obligation or ownership, only the promise of two people who had chosen to face the world together, as equals building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been broken. The woman who had once cowered in a leaking cabin, absorbing violence like a lightning rod drawing strikes away from her children, was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned that the greatest courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make decisions about how to live. As the sun set behind the peaks that surrounded their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Caroline smiled and called her family home for supper. They came running, Luke chattering excitedly about the rabbit he had seen near the stream, Emma proudly carrying vegetables from their garden, Jedediah moving with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world. They gathered around the table that Jedediah had built from timber he had cut himself, sharing food that they had prepared together, planning for a future that belonged to all of them equally. And in that simple domestic scene, Caroline found everything she had ever dreamed of during the darkest days of her captivity: safety, respect, love that lifted up rather than tearing down. The mountain man had said, "Enough," to the violence that had ruled her world. But more than that, he had shown her how to say yes to the life she deserved. And in that hard-won valley, surrounded by peaks that touched the sky and protected by love that would endure any storm, Carolyn finally understood what it meant to be truly free. The story that had begun with snow falling on a broken cabin and a woman dying by degrees had ended with spring sunlight warming a home built on hope. with children's laughter echoing off mountain walls. With the quiet strength of two people who had learned that the greatest victory was not conquering others, but refusing to be conquered themselves. And when visitors occasionally found their way to that remote valley, drawn by stories of the woman who had defied her husband's cruelty and the mountain man who had helped her find freedom, they always left with the same impression, that they had witnessed something rare and precious. A love story that proved human beings could rise above their worst impulses and build something beautiful from the ruins of what had been broken down in the end. That was Caroline's greatest triumph. Not that she had escaped Roy Cutter's violence, but that she had learned to create something better in its place. Something that would echo through the generations of children who would grow up in that valley, knowing from their earliest days that love was meant to heal, not harm, to build up rather than tear down. The mountain man had said, "Enough," to the darkness, and together they had let in the light.